Okay. Well, as you know, we're starting a new set of theses tonight, namely the 24 Thomistic Theses. And this is something of a departure in the sense that this is nothing I've dealt with before at the university level. The courses that we've gone through previously are ones that I actually taught in my teaching career. This is something a little bit on the side, and I'm not really sure where it's going to go. It's just perhaps an interesting diversion, but I don't know how many of you have heard about the 24 Thomistic Theses. They are not St. Thomas's theses in the sense that he directly wrote them, because they weren't initially published until 1914. And since he died in 1274, he doesn't have any direct knowledge of them, at least from when he was on this earth. But what basically happened after Leo XIII in the 1880s or so tried to revivify interest in scholastic, specifically Thomistic philosophy, they began to have a problem by the early part of the 20th century that many professors were teaching all sorts of things in the name of St. Thomas, and in many instances it was just their own version of reality. And so the Pope at the time, now St. Pius X, was concerned to do something to remedy the confusion which then existed. It's a confusion which tends to recur again and again, because even today you have a lot of people running around who say that they're Thomists, but they don't all teach the same thing. I've been in faculties where everybody was claiming to be Thomists, but the Thomists were not agreeing with one another. And there are some legitimate differences within Thomistic tradition. For example, there's a distinction between the Laval School of Thomism, the Toronto School of Thomism. Certainly the work that Father Woodbury did in Sydney represents a somewhat different strain of Thomism. But all of those are within what one might call the general orthodoxy of Thomism. But there also are people around who will say that they are Thomists, but they are more historians of philosophy who do not really follow what we would consider the central doctrines of Aquinas. And so Pius X was concerned that there be some kind of a way that people could know what really was authentic Thomism and what was not. And therefore, in 1914, he laid down the basic principles, the major doctrines of St. Thomas that he wanted to be used in the theological studies and in philosophical studies. Specifically, in fact, he insisted that in theological studies, the Summa Theologiae should be used as a textbook. So he was quite serious about doing this. Now, the problem is, what are the central doctrines of St. Thomas? And so that he had some of the leading Thomists of the time get together, and two of them in particular were very well known at the time, and they worked out these 24 central theses that one should hold if one is really following the philosophy of St. Thomas. And it isn't meant to be said that these are explicitly said by St. Thomas or that you'll find them in St. Thomas, but rather that those people who are teaching faithfully according to the mind of St. Thomas would be teaching in this fashion. And certainly in the 20th century, there is no more luminous Thomistic philosopher than the great theologian Reginald Garrigou Lagrange. And what I'm going to be doing tonight is following a chapter, it's chapter 15, out of his book, Reality. And to some extent, I'll be doing this I don't want to say line by line, but I'm going to follow him very closely because truly, while some people might think he's a bit old-fashioned, I think Lagrange represents probably the finest Thomistic mind of the 20th century, or certainly one of the finest Thomistic minds. And the method that I'm going to be following tonight is somewhat different than that which I've done in previous classes, where I really don't have much in the way of an outline, and I'm just giving you what I've given from many years of experience in the classroom. I'm not going to quite do that, but what I will be doing is something akin to what I received when I was doing my graduate work at the University of Notre Dame, and that is that some of the professors, and I'm thinking particularly of Professor Charles de Koninck, would take the text of the physics of Aristotle and literally look at it line by line and explain what each line meant. So I'm going to start out, this is a somewhat different methodology than I've used in the past. It's not quite as freewheeling, but given that Father Lagrange is the master of Thomism that he is, we will achieve, hopefully, in accuracy what we lack in mannerism of expression. That being said, let's take a look at the text itself, and I'll read a line and I will then comment on it, I hope. As I said, this begins in 1914 with a motu proprio of Pius X that prescribed that all courses in philosophy should teach the principles and the major doctrines of St. Thomas. And he does so because these are, as Father Lagrange says, these are safe norms of intellectual guidance. I mean, one of the things that he insisted upon is that if anybody deviates from the thought of St. Thomas, especially in metaphysics, he deviates greatly from the truth, and he runs the risk of great intellectual harm. And there's a great deal of truth in this. The Holy Father didn't want to mandate this as an article of faith, but he wanted to say clearly that this is the method that is preferred by the Church. And what we're doing here is not a course in theology, and I'm not going to try to determine what is the present attitude of the Church about teaching of Thomism in the schools. Since Vatican II, we've seen a lot of things happen, and we've seen particularly the kind of systematic Thomistic philosophy that was taught when I was an undergraduate, which would be prior to 1960. We had generally curricula in which you would have 18 to 24 hours of philosophy. They would be the systematic courses, beginning perhaps with logic, cosmology, or the philosophy of nature, philosophical psychology, the philosophy of man, metaphysics, natural theology, general ethics, and then special ethics. And this was a standard part of the core curriculum of all of the Catholic colleges and universities in North America and most of the English-speaking world. Well, that, as you well know, is not the case today. You're lucky today if you get a couple required courses in philosophy at a so-called Catholic college, and when you take the courses, there generally will be a bunch of history, everything from the ancient Greeks and Hindus up to the philosophy of what's happening now, baby, and everything in between. And the net result is the students being exposed to 30 or 40 different intellectual perspectives come out wondering if they know anything. And they become complete historical, epistemological, and ontological relativists because they haven't got a clue. I mean, after all, if I learn 30 different systems and nobody tells me that one is really right and the others are wrong, or how to sort out truth out of the midst of this porridge of intellectual jetson, I'm going to come out not having a clue as to what's right or what's wrong. And that is what happens. I remember Dr. Waters once telling me that when he was teaching, I think it was at the University of Montreal, that a graduate student came up to him and said, I'm studying the history of modern philosophy, and if you ask me what's the position of Kant or Descartes or Spinoza or Locke or Hume, I can tell you exactly what their position was, but if you ask me who's right, I haven't got a clue. Just don't know. So you're getting a lot of teaching and a lot of learning, but what people aren't doing is philosophizing. Because remember, you don't have any philosophy if you don't know the truth yourself. All you're doing is memorizing what other people have said. You have no philosophy except that which you yourself understand, and understand to be true. And you know that it is true, you know why it is true, and you know why it cannot be otherwise. That's the science of philosophy. Today what we have is just the kind of confusion that you'd get on the Oprah Winfrey show. It's billions of opinions, but what indeed is the truth? So what we're trying to focus in on here is indeed what are the central truths that St. Thomas held, and why did he hold them? And as I was reading through this chapter, and I wasn't really sure, I hadn't, I'd heard a lot about the 24 Theses, and sometimes these came up in intra-departmental debates and so forth, but you didn't really have to know them in order to be teaching philosophy, because nobody had been concerned about having such a summary for the last 100 years. And it seemed like it was just ancient history that somebody was defending these old 24 Theses, and some of the professors would say, we don't have to follow those anymore. Well, therefore, when I started reading this chapter by Father Lagrange, I suddenly realized, as he explained it, the first and central thesis is the distinction between potency and act. And of course, I've been studying that and teaching that for the last 40, well now 50 years. It's central, it's basic. It's so basic that it is indeed the very starting point of philosophy. So if I was a little bit worried that we'd get into something that was too sophisticated and abstract to start with, and it turns out, as is the case in all real philosophy, that the greatest truths are the simplest truths, and that you have to go back to the very starting point and the things that everybody should understand in order to not get off on the wrong path. And that all of the deviant, novel notions that people have today, they're into because they often don't know the starting point. And the starting point, of course, goes back to the ancient Greeks. But let's go back to Father Lagrange's article here and follow what he has to say. 1914, Pius X insists that we should know what these 24 Theses were. It wasn't mandating them, it's what people had to believe with an assent of faith. But what they wanted to do is to try to distill what is the essence of St. Thomas's thought. And indeed, he intended to recommend that this as the preferred philosophy of the Church. And in 1916, under Benedict XV, these were approved by a congregation, and this congregation's judgment was confirmed by the Holy Father himself as these being safe norms for intellectual guidance. The next year, 1917, the new Code of Canon Law came out, and in it, it mandates that the method, the principles, and the teaching of St. Thomas would be binding on professors and students both in philosophy and theology. And that was in the Code of Canon Law until the revision of 1983. Yeah. When things began to get a little more fuzzy. And again, I'm not concerned about the more recent theological adventures that one might want to explore, but I would suggest that this was a very significant point in the history of the church to lay down clearly that this is what is preferred and recommended. And I would not want to suggest that the church really has deviated from that judgment, at least in its core conviction. I think there may be some waffling on the edges, but even if there is, truth is truth, and this still remains what we should be attending to. So this would put even in the Code of Canon Law. Pope Benedict XV did not intend to impose these 24 Theses as compelling internal assent. In other words, to be a Catholic, you don't have to be a Thomistic philosopher right down to the core. But what you're going to find out is if you don't accept these theses, what happens is you lose the ability to do some things that the church does require we be able to assent to. For example, the doctrine that you can know the existence of God by the unaided light of natural reason. Because it turns out, and that according to an argument from effect back to cause and ultimately to first cause. And the problem is if you abandon some of these 24 theses, the proofs, the arguments don't work. So it becomes impossible to do what we Catholics would be bound by faith to say can be done. So this is very serious material to get right. The question that arises particularly focuses upon the distinction between potency and act. Potency is what is able to be, but is not. Act is what actually is. But the distinction between potency and act runs through the very center of metaphysics. It runs through the center of all the sciences of philosophy. It runs through the explanation of how change is possible, how motion is possible, how man's soul can be related to his body, how the existence of things is related to their essence. Potency and act is at the core of all things. And some suggested, even in the name of Thomism, that potency and act were just a hypothesis. The problem with a hypothesis is you don't know if it's true. And if you're not convicted of the truth of the distinction between potency and act, all kinds of funny things happen. So we're going to be focusing upon potency and act right at the beginning. Indeed, if potency and act is just a postulate or hypothesis, that the difficulty is that is the first principle. It's the foundation of all the central theses in the Thomistic corpus, including the proofs for God's existence. In fact, as Lagrange says, in truth, if we study the commentaries of St. Thomas on the first two books of Aristotle's Physics and books 3 and 4 of his Metaphysics, we see the real distinction of potency from act imposes itself necessarily on the mind, which attempts to harmonize the principle of contradiction or identity with that of becoming or multitude. I know you're wondering, you're glazing over at this point, wondering, what are we talking about? I'm going to explain it. This is why I say we go back to the very starting point of philosophy. And nobody objects to going to the starting point because it's easier for everybody to start there. It goes back to the very principle of non-contradiction. That which is, and that which is not. Being is, non-being is not. That is the formula of Parmenides. And we're going way back, centuries before Christ. We're going back before Aristotle. We're going back before Plato. We're going back before Socrates. We're going back to about 500 or 450 BC. Long time ago. And this distinction between potency and act, you're going to find it in Aristotle, where he introduces it. And you might say, well, then what's the big deal about St. Thomas? Well, St. Thomas adds to what Aristotle does and solves problems Aristotle doesn't address, and gives us, above all, that major distinction between essence and existence, which is the hallmark of an existential metaphysics that Aristotle didn't have. But the initial distinction between potency and act, Aristotle gave to us, and critically so, because Parmenides started out, by the way, if you're wondering, how does this affect modern philosophy? Well, it turns out because of people getting the wrong explanation following Parmenides and the wrong explanation following the fellow who opposed Parmenides by the name of Heraclitus, you find all the modern errors in philosophy get exposed. So ironically, the modern problems in philosophy go back to difficulties that were initially posed way at the beginning of Greek philosophy by Parmenides and Heraclitus. And it's the solution of their difficulties that was given by Aristotle and later on embellished by St. Thomas and everybody in between, which gives the correct perspective to resolve the modern problems of philosophy. None of this is outdated. If it turns out that the key ingredient to not getting things confused in the present is to go all the way back to the beginning and see how the initial establishment of potency and act was made so central to philosophy. Parmenides starts out by saying, what we know is being. What is given in experience is being. Being is, non-being is not. And from this, he very quickly concludes that nothing changes. Nothing changes. Because what happens when you have change is something comes to be that wasn't there before. Something comes to be. Well, how does it come to be? There's only two ways it could come to be. Either it comes to be from non-being. That's impossible. Non-being is not. You don't get being from non-being. So being can't come to be from non-being. Well, the other possibility is being must come to be from being. But then the difficulty is if being comes to be from being, well, it already was being, in which case nothing happened. There's no change. So change, he would say, is just an illusion. I'm not going to get into the question of trying to refute that part of it, but watch the logic of what he says. It may seem absurd at first blush, but nobody could answer him. Nobody could, thing either is or it isn't. That's simple enough. If it is, how can it come to be when it's already is? So is becomes is, it still is. So nothing new. And you're not going to get is from non-is, being from non-being. That's impossible. So nothing ever changes. If you think you see change, that's just an illusion, just a bad dream. And more than that, you have to understand from Parmenides' standpoint, because all you have is being, you can't have many beings. Not only can't you have them change, but they can't be many, because if you have here's a being and here's a being, well, what separates them? Well, non-being, but non-being is not. So if nothing separates them, all you have is continuous being. So you only have one being. There's no way to divide being. All it is continuous being. You have to understand his notion of being is identified with spatial extension. I don't know how to convey this in an imaginative sense, except reality is like being stuck in the middle of the Hoover Dam. It's just solid concrete. doesn't change, homogeneous throughout, and there's no division in it. Only he conceived of all reality like a great big, concrete block of being. That's all it is, just solid being. And he conceived it like being a sphere, a huge, absolutely indivisible sphere of being, which is that notion that was picked up later on by the Democritus and Leucippus as the basis of the notion of the atom, as being tiny, tiny, indivisible little balls or little entities that were absolutely indivisible. They took Parmenides' great big being and reduced it to infinite numbers of little tiny things. And they built their material philosophy out of that. But for Parmenides, it was just like one great big marble. Solid existence, being, solidity, physical solidity, absolutely unchanging, forever. One of his disciples took it one step further and said, well, wait a minute, you got this big sphere, okay. Well, what's outside the sphere? Either being or non-being, right? Okay. If it's non-being, there's nothing outside the sphere. In which case, the sphere must be infinite. Or if it's being, there's no reason to ever limit the extension of being. So I think he's more logical than Parmenides. He comes to the conclusion, if you can imagine it, it's kind of mind-boggling. Like I say, imagine yourself being kind of sealed in the center of the Hoover Dam. You got infinite solidity. Infinite. No edges, no end, no terminus, absolutely unchanging forever. That would be the concept that you get. Well, this is sort of an interesting but philosophical dead end. At about the same time, a chap by the name of Heraclitus comes along, and he takes the other end of the argument. Parmenides had used pure logic to conclude that reality is absolutely unchanging forever. But in so doing, he denied the evidence of his senses. And a good philosopher never ignores the evidence of his senses. So Heraclitus starts at the other end of the argument, and he says, okay, wait a minute. We do live in a world that's changing. In fact, he said, because it is changing, to be is to change. You couldn't get more at the other end of the spectrum from Parmenides. To be is to change. Everything is pure becoming. And he even likened reality to fire. By the way, I should tell you, we don't really know too much about these guys because we have very little evidence of them. There's a book called Nam's Fragments of the Pre-Socratics, and you wouldn't even find them in a burial urn. There's hardly anything there. It's just a little tiny book, just little lines. Some of them we have only one line from. And we have a fairly complete picture of their philosophy thanks to Aristotle, who happens to give in his works a recounting of their positions. But that's the only way. In terms of the original sources, we have virtually nothing. I always think the fragments of the pre-Socratics, it sounds like a burial urn. But that's really all that we have. So to some extent, we're trying to imagine and understand what their philosophy said. But Heraclitus was completely at the opposite end of the spectrum from Parmenides, and their disciples argued back and forth for 100 years. Nobody could decide who was right. They couldn't unsort the problem at all. There's a famous argument supposedly took place between a disciple of Parmenides and a disciple of Heraclitus, in which the Parmenidean gesticulated so forcefully that he dislocated his shoulder. And then he begged the Parmenidean or the Heraclitean to come over and set it for him. And the Heraclitean said, I would love to do that, but that would entail a change. And unless you're willing to admit that you're wrong, I can't help you. But you might think, well, this is absurd. This is ancient history. Nobody would take this stuff seriously. Well, nobody could explain it. Nobody could answer it. And down through the history of philosophy, Parmenides has had a profound influence on those that we know of as being essentialists, those who tend to view the world in a very unchanging world of essences that are very stiff and rigid and simply don't bend, as it were. You don't really find that in reality so much, but it's more something that the other guys point to as being a defect of what they think is found in Aristotelian or scholastic philosophy. The other guys I'm referring to here are those that belong to Heraclitus and follow what we call process philosophy. Evolution, the notion that all things are becoming at all times. There are no stable essences. There are no unchanging and eternal truths or beings or species or anything of the sort. Everything is in a constant state of becoming and flux, and everything's evolving towards some grand omega point or something. And this way of looking at the world, you find a lot more of that. You find a lot more of that in your contemporary materialism, in the contemporary evolutionists, and all of the types of philosophy that are spun off it, the things that you find in Bergson and Teilhard de Chardin, and all of process philosophies which insist that nothing is really stable. And from an evolutionary standpoint, man is not a stable species. We are simply the end product of unending gradual changes, which are still going to continue even into the future. So there's no stable nature of man. There's no stable nature of morality. Morality evolves too, according to the culture and according to the times. All of this we inherit from Parmenides and from Heraclitus. We do not escape them. And unless there is a way to answer the dilemma, the paradox that they posed, we would be forever trapped in these kind of alternatives. You find this, the process one is the one that really is the dominant one in the last 2 centuries. You find this in Hegel, the idea that being begets non-being, and then non-being somehow unites with being to produce becoming. And you're often running with a dialectic that's picked up by Marx for his economic historical materialism. Did you have a question?
Who started the process? What was that, Heraclitus?
That's Heraclitus, yes. Okay, so anyway, back to Father Lagrange. But this is really what Dr. de Koning used to do. He would, you find one line, and there's fertile ground within the line. And that's why when I was taking the philosophy of nature from him, we spent the first 2 months of the course doing the first 2 paragraphs of the physics. And he promised that by the time we got to the end of the course, we'd covered the first 2 books of the physics. And he said, well, of course, we've got 1 class left, and we're going to cover the physics. So we started about 2 p.m. And he ran through the last 6 or so books of the physics in about 3.5 hours. But, I mean, you have to appreciate the quality of the first 2 books, which we spent more time on. Okay, so according to Parmenides, walking is a mere appearance. The principle of identity, being is what it is the primordial law, both of the mind and of reality. This is Parmenides. For the same reason, Parmenides concludes the impossibility of more than one being. And I gave you the reason for that. You can't have multiple beings because there's nothing between them, so they're all just one being. Parmenides, like Spinoza later on, confounds being in general with divine being. Now, what that means is, when you conceive of being the way that Parmenides does, it turns out to be God. It's an eternal, unchanging substance. Now, of course, Parmenides' way of looking at it, he's thinking of it as material substance. But he's still got the basic insight that being absolutely considered in itself would be eternal and infinite. And he's onto something, but the problem is he's also off something. And of course, we see with Spinoza, same thing. Spinoza is the classical example of a pantheist. Everything is God. I mean, he starts out in his ethics. I don't ask me why it's called his ethics, because it sounds like metaphysics to me. He starts out by defining being. This is Spinoza. We're up in the 18th century. Is that? He says, what is substance? Substance is that which exists in itself and through itself. Well, if a thing exists in itself and through itself, it must exist. Therefore, substance necessarily exists. Well, by the time he's done, there's only one substance. One substance, its attributes and its modes, and it turns out that's God. And he's just given a version of the ontological argument, by the way. Argument that from the concept, you can prove the reality of God. From the very notion of substance, you prove that substance exists and everything is that one substance. That what we call material and spiritual are simply different attributes of one and the same substance. So he's a classical pantheist, but that's a direct offshoot of Parmenides thought. Then, of course, we have Heraclitus. I've already just described. Now, how do we get out of this problem? We finally come to Aristotle. I skipped over Plato because we're not trying to do the history here. I'm really just trying to, how do you get a solution to the problem? Plato tried to solve it by having this world of pure forms, which was like a doppelganger, a second world that this world is a participation and imitation of. And in the world we live in, all things are changing, but the world of pure forms, after which, you have trees and horses and beauty and justice and all these things in the world around us, and they are just participations of this world of pure forms where beauty and justice and truth are eternal and unchanging realities. So all he's done, it's like a prize fight where you take the two prize fighters and the referee sends one fighter to one corner and one to the other. Plato's saying, we'll take Parmenides and give him heaven. He'll have the world of pure forms. And we'll take Heraclitus and we'll give him the earth where everything's changing. Well, unfortunately, that doesn't allow the combatants to fight. To allow them to fight, you've got to accept something from both corners. And this is what Aristotle does. Aristotle grants that the process of becoming is an evident fact of experience. Okay, we're not going to get rid of it. Change is part of reality. Not necessarily all reality, but it is given an experience, and undeniably so. So we need to explain it. And he says this fact of experience is to be harmonized with the principle of identity and contradiction. Identity and contradiction we get from Parmenides. Parmenides tells us being is what it is. That's your identity. Being cannot both be and not be. That's the principle of non-contradiction. That we get from Parmenides. And too many people forget it today. We're not going to forget it, we're going to keep it. We're going to use it. But it must be combined with the real distinction between potency and act. And this is the, not merely hypothesis, but this is a necessary set of principles to explain the world in which we live. This is what's required in order to solve the arguments of Parmenides against the reality of generation or becoming and multiplicity. And the explanation is relatively simple. If we're looking at a statue A statue does not arise from something that is already a statue. I'm quoting Father Lagrange here. You don't get a statue from what is already a statue, nor does it come from what is simply nothing. You know what you got to do to get a statue. You got to go out and get some marble, a block of marble. That which comes into existence comes to be from what we call indeterminate potential being. Now, what the heck is it? That's the block of marble. Indeterminate? No, it's not indeterminate. It's got the shape of a block. But it's indeterminate in reference to the shape of the statue. That's what it's indeterminate in reference to. Indeterminate means it hasn't got the shape. It hasn't got it. So it has to get it. That's what has to come to be. But you don't start with absolutely nothing. Nothing doesn't have the ability to become. From non-being, you don't get being. So to get something, you got to start with something. It's got to be real. But it can't be that which is going to come to be. It has to just be something that can become that which is going to come to be. So that which comes into existence comes from indeterminate potential being, which is a real capacity to receive an actual perfection. The block of marble is really able to be sculpted into the shape of the statue. It's really got that capacity. Non-being doesn't have the capacity. A bowl of porridge doesn't have the capacity. See, that block of marble has the capacity because it has the ability to be sculpted and to receive a form given to it by the sculptor. Well, I'm giving you marble here, and Father Lagrange is using wood, so we'll switch to wood. The statue comes from the wood, yes, but not from the wood as wood. It's not because it's wood that it's going to be a statue of Michelangelo or something, David or whatever. But the wood is capable of being carved. The block of marble is capable of being chipped. So it doesn't come from the marble as marble, it comes from the marble as chippable. Movement, that's what we're talking about when something's going to become something new. Movement supposes a subject, in other words, you already got something there, really capable of undergoing motion. You've got to start with being. You don't start with non-being. But you start with being that isn't the way it's going to be after it changes. And that's where we get the notion of form. In other words, you start with a prior form that isn't the same as what you're going to get after the change. See, we shifted from making a statue to talking about movement. But in every movement, what you're doing is acquiring some new, have to use the word, form. Some new way of being. It wasn't there before. So it's critical to realize that we don't start with non-being absolutely. And we don't start with being absolutely. We start with relative non-being and relative being. Aristotle's going to introduce it. Father Lagrange doesn't do it here, but we got to do it. He's going to tell us that the problem that Parmenides had is that he's using the word being univocally. He's using it in exactly the same way every time he uses it. And it's true, if being meant exactly the same thing every time you used it, then you could never distinguish between one being and another being, because they'd all be the same being. Nothing, A couldn't become B because A would already be B. You'd have an identity that isn't real. There is a real difference between the before and after. Parmenides is saying there is no difference, because if you define being as that which is, then that which is becomes that which is, and it already was. So nothing happened. Aristotle says, wait a minute, being is not a univocal term. Univocal term means every time you use it, you have exactly the same meaning. No, he says being is analogous, and that's what's given in experience. Analogy means things are somehow the same, somehow different. And that's true of everything we see in the world around us. There are countless billions of beings, but they're all different. They have in common that they're being, but they're different beings. And that's given in experience. And a good philosopher doesn't deny experience. I always loved Parmenides because he's so logical. But it's not logical to deny experience. Heraclitus is faithful to experience, but he's not logical in terms of dealing with the terms of becoming. So,
Dr. Bonnette?
yes.
Does this philosophical problem then come down to a linguistic problem? Was it really a failure to understand how language works?
Well, remember always that first we know things, and then we invent words to describe them. So that the problem, if it's linguistic, it is first epistemic. It's first something that we didn't understand properly. And it is not a proper understanding of things to think that they are absolutely identical to one another. But of course, the words reflect reality, and therefore if we misuse the way that we use the words, we can confuse ourselves as to what the reality is. So reality simply isn't univocal. And in fact, in order to use words univocally, we engage in a process called abstraction. So when I say, everybody in this room is a human being, that's true, isn't it? And it does mean the same thing. You're not a bunch of cats or dogs. But no one of us is a human being exactly the way that everybody else is. We all express humanity, but we do it in our own unique way. So it's a little more subtle than just saying we're all the same. To say that we are all the same is to abstract from or prescind from or ignore the differences and only notice what's the same. But to do that, we're pulling out what's common. That's a process of intellectual abstraction, which the mind does. The mind naturally likes to classify things. But in the process of classifying all birds as one, we ignore the differences between them. But you don't want to affirm the differences to the point that you don't realize they got something in common. They both have something in common and something that makes them different. That's what we mean by analogy. And being, the basic application of being is the recognition, sure, everything exists, but everything affirms existence in a different way. So we're always going to have to play a little balancing act between likeness and difference, and that's what analogy is about. That's what Parmenides missed. Aristotle applies this notion of act and potency to in a different way when he looks at something like the fact that if you have many animals that are of one specific kind, just like I said, we're all human, we're all birds of birds, you can have little subspecies of birds if you want. How do you explain that they're different? The act, in other words, what makes them to be birds or to makes us to be human, that's what we have in common. That's what actualizes us as human or actualizes birds as birds. So why are they different? Why are we different? If the act is the same, you're going to have a corresponding potential principle that's different. And the corresponding potential principle that makes them different and makes us different is our form, which makes us human, is received in different matter. So while we're all human, our bodily expression of our humanity is different. We have different bodies. It's a little more complex than that, but that's basically it. I don't want to slip into a Platonism that says we have identical souls, but the body is all different, and you wind up in a Cartesian kind of thing. As remember, you got to follow hylomorphic philosophy that tells you the form and matter constitute one substance. So it's more complex than that. But it is still true, and what Aristotle's doing is applying the notion of act and potency in a new way. Instead of explaining it as how you explain change from one thing to another. And remember, this is not hypothesis. To explain change, real change, you've got to have a potential principle and an actual principle. In addition to being and non-being, you've got to distinguish between being in potency and being in act. But realize that being in potency is not pure non-being. You can't get the statue from nothing. You got to get it from a block of marble, which is being. It's being under one form becomes being under a different form. And of course, what you're doing is taking the same stuff, the same marble, and giving it a new form. So you're going from potency to act, from a prior form to a subsequent form. So what specifies, in other words, puts things into their species, what makes them to be of this form or that form, or to be under this way of existing or that way of existing, is the formal principle. And that's why form gets equated with act. See, when it comes to be, it gets a new form. So form is the act. That's the connection. If form is the act, then what makes them different? You're going to have a corresponding potential principle. That's the role of the body. See? So this is how Aristotle takes the initial insight of act and potency and analogously transfers it to a new explanation for how things can be many but still be